Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're logging on in the world, and welcome to our third and final for this morning Climate Perspectives leadership interview organised as part of Energy Security and Green Infrastructure Week. And I'm delighted to welcome into our enclave here Tom Burke, the co-founder and chair of E3G, which is a climate change think tank, a think tank with a global outlook that also works on the frontier of the climate landscape, tackling the barriers and advancing the solutions to a safer climate. Given that E3G's goals are to translate climate politics, economics and policies into action, and we've discussed a lot of those already this morning, I think Tom is going to be ideally placed to offer his thoughts and insights on climate leadership. He's also someone who's been a senior environmental advisor in government and business, and who also ran the Green Alliance and Friends of the Earth earlier in his career. So he's got vast knowledge of this sector. That's me, Andy Walker, will be talking with Tom for in total around about half an hour. If you've got any questions for Tom, please post them in the chat, and we'll try and get to those in the time that we've had available. Tom, as someone, welcome, by the way, and thanks for joining us here today.
Hi.
As someone who has been in his career a former executive director of Friends of the Earth, the Green Alliance, and has also been a special advisor to 3 secretaries of state for the environment, what's your view on why leadership is so important in the fight to tackle climate change?
I think the reason the leadership is so important is because we have to do something that's on the scale of mobilizing for a war. In order to make the energy transition, the scale of that as we change our energy system, our transport system, a lot of our agriculture system, in order to keep the climate safe, the scale of that is massive, and the time in which we've got to do it is limited. So we have to get on with it. And in a sense, that puts a real burden on leadership. It's not just managing these changes, it's actually creating leadership. Now, the difference between leadership and management is management gets you to do what needs to be done. Leadership gets you to do what you want to do. And it's really how leadership is what addresses the motivation. I don't think people need to become aware anymore of just how big a problem we're dealing with in climate change. But then they've got their lives to get on with. What they really want is for government and business, others, to get on with doing something about it and giving a clear narrative about what that means for them. I think we're missing a bit of that actual bit of leadership. And what we're actually finding is lots of people, whether they're in local communities or cities or towns or businesses, everywhere, people are actually all over the place trying to do whatever they can to address the problem themselves.
So this thing about leadership then, it's kind of preparing the ground, making it easier, enabling people to do the right thing.
It really, I mean, what I say to people in E3G is that facts change policy, narratives change politics. And that's because it's the story that provides the motivation, the narrative. Why are we doing this? Why does it matter? What does it make sense to me to do something? That's the thing that leaders give, is the narrative. Lots of us can do the analysis and come up with the different bits of management that you've got to do. But if somebody isn't leading, it's very hard to get those things actually done.
You were quoted in The Guardian recently saying that people needed to be told what the consequences of inaction on the climate are. Can you expand on that, and why did you say it?
Yeah, I said it because I think that we have a very limited conversation at the moment on climate change. We have a conversation basically taking place between the incumbent fossil fuel industries and the insurgent renewables, the carbon-free industries, and governments somehow trying to sort of arbitrate between the two of them. And those are all the people involved in climate policy success. Actually, the missing voices are the voices about all the businesses that will be damaged by climate policy failure. Well, if you look at what happened in Europe this summer, extended periods of 40-degree plus temperature across the whole of the northern Mediterranean, then you're looking at climate policy failure within a decade you're looking at that being a regular occurrence in the summer. Well, that will have enormous implications for the tourist industry, for instance. Well, its voice isn't present in these debates at the moment, but put it like this: if climate policy fails, it'll be a bit late to stand up later and say, oh dear, we've got it, we're in trouble.
You've used the word failure a few times there. Are our politicians failing us on the environment, Tom?
Yeah, I think they are. The thing that's different about climate change is you don't have to just get to the right place, which we quite often know but don't manage to do. You've actually got to get there within a specific amount of time. And what people don't really understand is the timing is determined by the physics of carbon in the atmosphere. It's not determined by our choices. Our choices and the physics of carbon in the atmosphere determine whether the policy succeeds or fails. And we know what we've got to do. We've got to get to a carbon-free energy system by the middle of the century if we want the climate to stay safe.
So we see a lot of talk, especially in the UK, about climate issues from government, and particularly when we look at the politics of it, it seems to me that the climate is being used in some cases as a wedge issue to bolster support for different kind of political parties. Do you think going forward there's a danger that the government might backtrack on their commitments in the face of economic challenges? Is that something that worries you?
I think you're absolutely right about the sort of political difficulties, but I don't think that's actually focused on the economic so much. The reality is we already have the technology we need to make the climate safe. We're just simply not deploying it fast enough. And why on earth would you think that 70% of the energy from the fossil fuels we burn ends up as waste heat? Why would you think you damage your economy by getting rid of all that waste? You won't. But you will change the pattern of winners and losers. And that does matter politically. And that's why the politics has got so difficult. And there's an ideological component to the political difficulties, which is this: the state has got to intervene. The market will not deliver this in time. So the state has to intervene. So the state and the government have to, and the markets, businesses have to work together to get us to where we actually know we can get to. Well, there are a lot of people who think you should keep the state out of all this stuff. I think that's fantasy land. I think that will lead us to climate policy failure. So you have to work out, what do you need the state to do, and what is it the bit that you can leave to markets? And by the way, it's interesting that it's the financial markets, it's central bankers who've really understood this. It was Mark Carney who said, 7, 8 years ago, that climate change represents an existential threat to macroeconomic stability. Now, that central banker language is very constrained, but take away macroeconomic stability and you get 2008 in spades.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of talk about personal responsibility when it comes to climate change, and obviously equally a lot of talk about what the government and official bodies should do. I'm going to come back to the government in a minute, but I'm just struck by an interesting question that's raised in the chat, a somewhat pessimistic one. Mandy quotes James Lovelock's Gaia theory, where he said that he doesn't think that we're yet evolved to the point where we're clever enough to handle a complex situation as climate change. And he goes on to say that humans are too stupid to prevent climate change from radically impacting on our lives over the coming decades. And that's a somewhat pessimistic view. Nevertheless, Mandy's asking, what's your view on those thoughts from James Lovelock?
I think James understood an enormous amount about how the Earth system works and the dynamics of the Earth system, and not very much about that bit of the Earth system that's ruining it, which is human beings. So he was much better as an Earth system scientist than he was as an anthropologist. I don't think there's any question about how clever people are. I think we're well clever enough to deal with this problem, but we're not working together, which is why that question about leadership that you raised at the beginning is so important. What leadership gets us to do is to work together, is to pull together. You look at what happened in Britain when the Second World War broke out. All of a sudden, a divided country came together, but it took Winston Churchill's leadership to pull it together. The same in the United States with Roosevelt. In the United States, in 1 year between December 1941 and December 1942, 90 years ago, changed the whole of its economy over from producing white goods and cars to producing ammunition and tanks. So it's not that we can't do something on this scale or that we're not clever enough. It's that we're not organizing ourselves. A lot of that is because we're trying to run our politics as if we were still in the 19th century. So what we need is a political software upgrade, not new human beings.
So just on that then, is it the case that you think there needs to be a more longer term view that's been advanced by our politicians? I mean, I know it's very difficult for them because they're in a 5-year political cycle, but nevertheless, some of the things that you just spoke about there, these were leaders who were thinking way, way into the long term. They weren't just thinking about the here and now. They were thinking about what do we need to do in order to safeguard our economy, our communities, our society for the future. Is there enough of that going on in relation to explaining climate change?
No, there's not. We're being let down by our current crop of political leaders. I'm not now choosing left or right, particularly in this. And part of that is because the people who are, as it were, conducting the national conversation, the editorialate, if you like, seem to be very committed to dividing us rather than uniting us. And I do think there's a real danger if you go on, as a sense, getting politicians can only get into office if they find wedges in order to, as it were, align with a base. We're not going to solve this problem. So we do need a very different kind of political conversation. We don't necessarily need dominance of left or right in particular, but we do need a political conversation that, as you say, Andy, is addressing long-term issues that are about survival. Remember, climate policy failure means we lose food and energy security across the planet. Well, think of how dependent we are on importing food for our food security. A loss of food security elsewhere is not their problem only, it's also our problem.
So what you've raised there, it really chimes with me about, the consequences if we don't get this right. But a lot of, and I'm no psychologist, but what I do understand about psychology is that people tend to respond to positive imagery about how different things could be in a positive way rather than all this negativity. How do you think politicians in particular, we'll deal with them first, how do you think they should be more positive about what good policy looks like around the climate?
I think you're absolutely right about that, Andy. And there are one or two politicians who are really emphasizing the opportunities of building a carbon-free energy system, in particular when it comes to power, electricity, which we're going to go on needing. People's energy demand is growing, and also mobility, movement. And in those two sectors, there are fantastic opportunities to lower the cost. If you have an electric vehicle, you have a much simpler and cheaper and easier to maintain piece of kit than you do if you have an internal combustion engine. It's enormous benefits apart from directly to you as a consumer. Now, can government help you make those transitions faster? Well, yeah, it can do. If you focus on getting the cost of capital down rather than putting the cost of carbon up, you're more likely to get people to see the opportunity side. So it's same in the big debate that's running in Britain at the moment. Are heat pumps too expensive? Well, heat pumps are very expensive in terms of capital, but they deliver for you over the long term. That means you need to make it possible for homeowners, householders, if you like, to get access to capital at the same sort of rate the government gets access to capital. That would enormously accelerate the rate at which people will want to take these things up, because at the end of the day, their bills will go down.
Interesting you mentioned heat pumps, because I was reading somewhere just in the last few days about the number of social housing providers that are starting to bring that in. And it comes back to your point about the role of the state and about what the state does in terms of making the investments that are needed in order to sort of change the way that we actually do things. Because if you take housing, for example, is that sector going to be transformed without state support? I'm not sure that it is. I don't know what your thoughts are on that against the background of, and you said it yourself, where people are saying, well, we need to take the state out, when actually maybe we need to be a bit more statey, if I can use that phrase.
Yeah, well, in fact, Keir Starmer has made it very clear he wants to bulldoze the planning system in order to get more houses built for people who need houses. I think he'd probably be better off if he was looking at how to get houses built by local councils in the way in which places where people live, rather than executive homes in rural areas, for wealthy people. So I mean, housing is a central piece of it. Our buildings in Britain are the worst insulated buildings in the whole of Europe. So we need to do more, not only to get people's bills down, but also that adds additional burden of about $1 billion and a bit every year to the health costs of the NHS. So there's real opportunity there to do lots of good things. But you've got to get people to pull together. And that's why I don't necessarily think the state should do all this, but it's got to provide the framework, the enabling framework in which people can help themselves much better than it's doing it at the moment. In particular, it's got to create the conditions which allow, when leverage in private capital to all these things, from private, if you like, our savings point of view, these are massive opportunities to secure good investments. But the state has to create the conditions. Doesn't have to do it all itself.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested that you mentioned that as well, because we spoke earlier about how some of these issues are being used politically to garner support, and I was particularly struck by what you said in the aftermath of the Uxbridge by-election about how the issue of the ultra-low emission charge was used, I suppose, as a wedge issue to try and kind of whether it divide people, win political support. I mean, in the UK in particular, with a general election approaching, do you think we can expect more of that kind of approach from our politicians?
I think we're going to hear more of that approach in the King's speech today. I think we've seen it, and I think it's very cynical, and it's a clear case of a government putting its party interest above our national interest. There's clearly nothing to be gained nationally by delaying. It's based on a false choice between the economy and the climate. I think that's a completely false choice. I think what's good for the climate is going to turn out to be good for the economy, but it's not good for the lobbies. And what you're seeing, in a sense, the lobbies, big influence because they're closer to power, are closer to any government in place, and you're seeing that voice amplified by, let's say, the editorial, particularly on the right. And the reason for that amplification is because there really are a lot of people who think these days, who think government gets in the way and you should get government out of the way and somehow we'd all be better off. And I think it's a pretty fair example of the first thing you turn to when things go wrong is government. And if you've not sustained government, you find the situation we now find ourselves in, with a government that's saying it wants to increase and do something that some people at least care a lot about, which is increase the sort of criminal, the way people pay for crime. But at the same time, as you can't get anybody tried because we haven't invested enough in the court system, so that the people they want to put in jail don't ever get tried in the court. So you've really got to put lots of things together if you want to get to a safe climate. You can't do it by taking government out of the mix.
I think we're looking at the positive side of that as well. There's clearly a massive marketplace, and what we're doing with Energy Security and Green Infrastructure Week, I think, proves it. Some fantastically innovative companies who are doing amazing stuff, and they need the framework, they need the business kind of backdrop to be able to do what they do best in order to make a difference on these issues. And maybe we should be talking more about the potential marketplaces there to actually do good. I mean, what's your view on that?
I certainly think that this is exactly the massive amount of opportunity is exactly right to create, and actually particularly to create lots of work for small business. A lot of the real generation of growth and higher incomes in the economy is generated by small and medium-sized enterprises. These are the people who are best placed to take the opportunities and best placed to benefit from the driving bills down. So there's a real opportunity-driven piece there. But Andy, there's something else in the point you've just made that I think is important. We tend to look at the big players because we're accustomed to looking at big companies doing big things. And we don't realize just how much a small amount of small things are being done massively all across the country and indeed all across the world, but they're not aggregated together. Now, what that reminds me of is there was a time at the end of the 90s when we were as a country, we were the dominant country in cycling. And I remember what the then manager of our cycling team said about when he was asked why did Britain suddenly become where there was no quite the same cultural expertise and cultural support for cycling. Why did we become certainly good? He said it was all about the aggregate of marginal improvement. The aggregate of marginal improvement. Well, there's an enormous amount to be done to sum up and articulate what that aggregate is of what's already being done, and then also to say, well, what could we do at all sorts of different levels, not just in national capitals, but also in cities in particular, to actually maximize that aggregate of marginal improvements as we try to get to carbon-free energy system.
Well, speaking of improvements and actions, COP28 is on the horizon around the theme of what they call actionism going forward, who are rising. It says on their website, actionists are people who are rising to meet the climate change challenge. And this chimes the question in the chat from Andrew. What are your hopes, Tom, for COP28? What do you expect? What do you hope to come out of it?
Well, my hopes and expectations are not exactly the same. But the most important thing is that the COP goes on. And there are a lot of people who get very frustrated because progress seems to be slow. You're only trying to get 8 billion people and 200 governments to agree something. So don't expect it to be fast and don't expect it to be smooth. But also, it misunderstands what goes on at the COPs. What goes on at the COPs are negotiations to take the next step forward by governments. And that's the 3,000 or 4,000 government officials that are at the center of the COP. But around that, 30 or 40,000, in a sense, a global town square of people from every kind of walk of life, from business, from the finance world, from civil society organizations, entrepreneurs, innovators. They're all there talking to each other exactly about what you have been focusing on, Andy, which is how to create this into an opportunity-driven rather than a constraint-driven way forward. And keeping that forum, it's the only global forum of its kind. It really is. Elon Musk talks in a silly way about Twitter being a global town square. I think it's more like a sort of global speaker's corner than a town square. But I do think the COPs are beginning to create exactly that kind of aspiration for a place where the world gets together to talk about what we can do about climate change. And all that goes back to feed into the national conversations around the world. So we often have the wrong expectations about the headlines that come out of the COPs.
Tom, for those that aren't aware of your work at E3G, what kind of stuff are you involved with currently, and how are you influencing and shifting the dial on this issue?
Well, what we try to do is to put the policy and the politics together, because otherwise lots of policy analysis ends up on the door into the room where the decisions are made and then doesn't get any further. So we are trying to both push forward the policy to get to the door and then to make sure there's some political pull on the other side of the door so that things get turned into action. And that means we work on things. We do a lot of work on climate diplomacy. For instance, we have a quite big team on climate diplomacy. We have a lot of people who are working, particularly who are working on green finance. So how do you, in a sense, respond to the challenge that Mark Carney set out? And how do you mobilize the financial community? And the financial community is really beginning to understand the risk that climate change presents, the risk that it presents to anybody investing in anything. And so we're helping to sort of develop those sort of policies and tools. And then how do you then get into the opportunity side? So we do a lot of work on the green economy and how you actually build a green economy. How do you deal with the power and transport, buildings, all of those different categories that you need to change. So what we're trying to do is develop these, if you like, more politically attuned policy prescriptions that we put into those different areas. So we don't work so much in the headlines as we work in the corridors, in the rooms where the decisions are taken, rather than trying to do it all by changing the headlines. I mean, there are others who do that, and that's a very important part of it. But we're not trying to hold up the whole of this on our own.
So that I'm interested in this, if you like, this kind of intersection between politics and policy. So you're basically promoting dialogue, understanding, and trying to, as you call it, basically get the right policy before the right politicians to actually implement it.
Yeah, and we build coalitions, whether I don't necessarily mean formal coalitions, but we put together groups of people who have aligned interests. And like I say, one of the challenges for us over the next few years is how do we get coalitions of those missing voices? How do we get them to play a part in that debate between the incumbents and the insurgents, as it were, in the climate policy success conversation? So that industries like the tourist industry I've mentioned. But here's the thing that you need to really think about. Climate policy failure moves the actuarial basis in which you can price risk. That makes insurance much more difficult to price. And we're already seeing in some parts of the United States, Florida and California, it's increasingly difficult for businesses and homeowners to get access to insurance because the risk is too difficult to price. Well, you think through, if we go on allowing these risks to build up, what will happen is where you can get insurance will start to shrink. Now, is that somewhere else? No. There are people in Britain where there have been floods now, 3 or 4 winters in the last 10 years, where it's very difficult for people to afford the insurance on their homes. So now you can argue about whether those particular incidents were driven by climate change or whether they're just a prequel to Climate Change, the movie. It doesn't matter in the sense that you're going to change the actuarial basis for pricing risk and therefore for insurance. Well, you try running capitalism without a functioning insurance system.
Yeah, I think the word you're looking for is impossible. I want to finish off on this because we talked a lot about the politicians and what they should and should be doing. From your perspective, from a leadership, through a leadership lens, what should the politicians be saying in the here and now, both in this country and looking at it internationally, in order to tackle, what is the issue of our age, really?
The two, if I were to pick one in each of the categories you said, domestically, we've really got to stop trying to fill a bath without a plug. And so we've got to do something about the energy efficiency of our buildings. So we need to declare our buildings critical national infrastructure and then invest in them like we invest in roads. And the same, use private public capital to do that. Domestically, it really is about finance. We've got to create the global flows of public finance that will lever in and crowd in private finance to enable people to make the energy transition and to help adapt more vulnerable systems to their climate. And remember, these countries are our markets of the future. I mean, I don't know that Brexit has done us any good, but if it was to do us any good, it sure as hell requires the rest of the world to be prospering so that we can get access to those markets.
Tom, your enthusiasm has shone through during the course of this conversation. You've obviously been involved in the sector for a number of years. Leave us with some grounds for optimism about the future in amongst all these challenges that we face.
Yeah, I tell you, it's my act of faith. There are 7,000 languages in the world. The five most powerful words in all of those languages? Can you help me and with? And by the time you've got to help, most people in most communities are trying to figure out if they can do something for you. That's my act of faith. In other words, there's nothing wrong with the people. So let's try and make government a bit better able to tap into what people are willing and able to do. And that's why I put such an emphasis on leadership.
Tom, fantastic. Really appreciate you taking the time out this morning to talk to us. Tom Burke, co-founder and chair of E3G. If you're not familiar with E3G's work, just go on their website. Some fantastic information on there, treasure trove of knowledge to look at. I look forward to you potentially commenting on the King's speech a little bit later on, Tom. We'll see what happens on that. Once again, thanks very much for taking part. Thanks to Tom. Thanks to Adrian, thanks to Xeon earlier for joining us this morning and sharing their interesting insights on climate leadership. Energy security and green infrastructure week continues tomorrow with a session on the energy economy. It's come up repeatedly in these 3 climate leadership sessions this morning. We're starting at 9 o'clock with a keynote session which addresses the key question of how do we deliver clean, secure and affordable energy for the rest of the century. And will also helping us do that with a keynote address is the author of the government's Mission Zero report, Chris Skidmore MP. So do join us for that. If you haven't already registered, get on the website greeninfrastructureweek.com and register for that session. Thanks very much for listening. Thanks again, Tom. And hopefully we'll see you all tomorrow morning bright and early at 9 a.m.